All right, if there are no questions, then we will start today's discussion. Just a quick reminder that we have a discussion today. We will have a discussion on Monday, and then your test will be, your due date is next Wednesday for test 3. Friday and Monday will be special sessions to ask questions about the final. There'll be review sessions for the final, and then your final will be, I believe it's the 4th or the 5th or the 5th or the 6th. I just sent out the email. I can't remember the exact date. Those are the dates dictated by the university. I didn't get a choice in them, so I just follow whatever the university says I must do for the final exam. So that's when they're given. Those dates aren't chosen by me. They're chosen by the university. And so those are the dates we have to go with. So please, as I said before, make your appointments early. The last couple of times I have given exams for students who have tried to wait to the last minute, they have not been able to find times on Examity to take the test. So please start early. If it's early and there's times run out, it's easier for me to ask for permission. But if you send me an email an hour before the exam saying you can't find time, there's not much I can do for you. So please start and schedule those exams early. All right, so let's get into today's discussion then. Today's discussion is we're going to cover Chapter 21, and we're going to go back through fiscal policy. All right, so just a reminder, fiscal policy, that is what is done really through Congress and the president, at least in the United States. That's who is responsible for fiscal policy. Fiscal policy only involves government purchases and taxation, nothing else. So fiscal policy involves the government purchasing goods and services or changing how it taxes usually individuals. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So kind of a review from Monday. And we talked about the multiplier effect, or at least we started to. Right? We talked about if the government buys $2 billion of trucks from Oshkosh, what happens? Well, the initial shift is $2 billion to the right. And then as Oshkosh receives some of this money, what the theory goes is that it circulates this through its workers, and their workers then buy more goods and services and so on. So as we give money to individuals or entities, what happens with that money is they go out and they spend more. And when they spend more, that has a multiplicative effect in the economy. So here's how it works. We increase spending. We shift rights to the initial government purchases. And then it shifts again. And it keeps shifting until we run out of kind of amplitude to it. And when do we run out? Well, we run out after there's a formula for it, and that's going to depend on the marginal propensity to consume, MPC. So if I'm given a $100 raise, how much of my raise am I going to spend? So the formula we talked about before, I believe, is 1 over 1 minus MPC is what we call the spending multiplier. And remember, that will work for both G, I, sometimes C. It will also work for taxation. Just really remember, taxation runs through C. And actually works for net exports as well. So I can't remember, but we're going to go through this really quickly to calculate the MPC and calculate the spending multiplier. So here I give you the MPC of 1/2, 3/4, and 9/10. So what should happen to the spending multiplier? You should get 2. You should get 4. You should get 10. So as the MPC increases, so does the multiplier. So we kind of talked about it before. A dollar increase is true for C, I, G, and NX. So it's true for all of them, not just G. So here's kind of the example of what we would talk about. So suppose a recession overseas reduced U.S. demand for net exports by 10 billion. MPC is 0.8. What is the change in output? Because the initial demand is 10 billion, we would multiply it by and we would find that this has a $50 billion impact on the U.S. economy. So sometimes you'll see what they call impact studies done by economists. When they talk about this has a $500 million impact on the economy, this is the kind of the math they're doing. It's a little more complicated than this, but this is the simple idea of how they come up with those numbers. Is they take, here's the initial shock or shift, they have some multiplier, they find a total shift. However, reminder that the crowding out effect still occurs. Okay, remember when the government increases spending by borrowing money, right? That pushes up the interest rate. And when the interest rates go up, investment goes down. So while we're having this multiplicative effect, so the government is pushing aggregate demand upward, there is this pull from investment or aggregate demand going downward as we push the interest rates up. So therefore, the aggregate demand may not be as big as we expect, because it's hard to judge exactly the impact of both of these things at once. Okay, so we know there is some push up. We also know there's some pull down. Most of the time in class, we'll make things easy. So when I ask you a question, we're only going to focus on the up part. We're going to leave the more complicated math out, the down part. So we're just trying to give the very simple, what's the push up? What's the impact up? So most of the time, if you read the questions, if you start to read the homework questions or the quiz questions, it'll say, what's the impact of a change in a total change of aggregate demand with no crowding out effects? So there's no negative effects. So if there's only positive, what's the upswing? We're not going to try to talk about there's this downswing. But as individuals, we should understand that there is this pull down, that there's a pull up and a pull down, right? Everything has a cost. And so we're focusing here on some of the cost of increasing government spending. Here's kind of the picture of what it looks like using our interest rate and money. All right, so as the government demands more money to buy goods and services, money supply didn't change, causes the interest rates to rise. When the interest rates rise, what happens? Aggregate demand is going to fall back. So just like a change in government spending has a multiplicative effect, so does a change in taxes. You will see some not so truthful people who will talk about, oh, increasing the taxes doesn't have an impact on the economy. If you believe government spending has a multiplicative effect, you believe taxes have a multiplicative effect. The theory is exactly the same, whether we talk about government spending or giving money to taxes, it still has the same impact. Why? Because if I give a tax cut, that means households have more money. When households have more money, they do what they always do. They spend a portion of it. And when they do, aggregate demand shifts right? And then we have both multiplicative effects and crowding out effects, just like before. So we have this impact on taxes, just the same story that we have on government spending. It's kind of frustrating when we hear people talk, oh, there's no impact when we cut taxes to the economy, but there is for government spending. They follow the same theory or the same idea. The only difference is taxes sometimes have a difference, and one of the reasons they might have a difference is a permanent tax cut has a bigger impact on aggregate demand than a temporary one. So sometimes a temporary one may not have very much of an impact, because if the government's going to cut my taxes today by $1,000 but raise them tomorrow by $1,000 because it's just temporary, what I might do is save that $1,000 so I can pay the bill back next year. So temporary ones don't have nearly the impact that what we call permanent ones do. So kind of a political science view. Remember, we talk about permanent as 10 years. Don't ask me why that's permanent. Under no other circumstances is it permanent, but in politics, people they found viewed 10 years as kind of a permanent tax cut. So you'll notice that when you hear about typically debates about changing taxes, they talk about having tax cuts in place for 10 years before it'll go back to normal or go back to what it was before. So they believe that to be kind of a permanent tax cut. So here's kind of an example. So policymakers are going to shift aggregate demand to the right by $200 billion to end the recession. So we're going to start with simple word. They need to get $200 billion to end the recession. So if MPC is 0.8, how much should Congress increase G by or decrease T to end the recession? Well, 1 over 1 minus MPC, I get 5. And so I know the multiplier is 5. So I want to get to 200 billion. So I take 200 divided by 5 and tells me that the government needs to increase government spending by $40 billion to get us out of the recession, or decrease taxes by a similar amount. If there is crowding out, will Congress need to increase G by more or less than this amount? Well, if there's crowding out, that means the impact will shift back. So it's going to have to be more than 40. So just how I showed you before how we would do it. And then we talked about how it has to be a larger amount. So hopefully you work at that problem at home while I'm talking about them. You should always be trying to work these problems out. So there's another side to fiscal policy, and what it focuses on is aggregate supply. This comes about in the 1980s. Because remember, in the 70s, we saw stagflation. And the problem with stagflation, as we talked about it, if I increase aggregate demand, that gets me more inflation. That gets me less unemployment. However, if I decrease aggregate demand, I get less inflation, more unemployment. So there wasn't a very simple traditional way to change aggregate demand to get us out of our problem. So what economists argued then is in the 80s is they said, well, here's what we know about things. We know people respond to incentives. So what we can do is we want to try to give workers incentives to work more. So we're hoping to try to increase the quantity of goods and services. And how we do that is we have to really lower costs to businesses. to make it easier to produce goods and services. Remember, this is, if you go back to chapter 4, this is a supply shifter. And the supply shifter also holds true in aggregate supply. So if I can make it a lower cost for businesses, I'm hoping to shift aggregate supplies to the right to offset the 70s oil shocks that shifted it to the left. So remember the oil shifted it to the left. So I want to shift it back. Also, how do I shift it back? Well, the easiest way is to try to lower costs for businesses, because the human capital isn't a very quick fix. Physical capital is not a very quick fix. Natural resources, I guess you could try to get more natural resources out, but that's usually not a quick fix. And all of a sudden, increasing technological knowledge isn't a very easy quick fix. So I'm really only left with one. I'm trying to lower the cost of businesses in hopes that they maybe can increase physical capital a little quicker. Right? Or other ways is we try to do it through better roads to increase productivity. Right? You can almost kind of look at this as a little bit as physical capital. But the problem with roads are they're not quick. They take long, long periods of time. Right here in Fort Smith, we're still talking about I-49. I came here 15 years ago. They were talking about this road being built. We're 15 years later and still not complete. We're hoping to do this to increase the ability to trade with the rest of the country. Makes better roads, makes it easier for us to transport goods and services. However, we still haven't finished that. So yes, roads will increase productivity. But as the book says, it's more relevant in the long run. There are some economists who argue that's all government really should do. It should not look to fix problems because most of the things that they buy are long-run issues. And they shouldn't be trying to fix short-term problems. Okay, what's our problem going to be 10 years from now? Because that's what they can really adjust. So let's kind of talk about what economists talk about active stabilization. So should the government get involved in trying to adjust the economy? So it starts with this idea behind Keynes. Keynes has this idea of what he calls animal spirits. And what happens is households either get too pessimistic or too optimistic based on the conditions. So when things are great, households and firms believe they're going to be great forever. When things are bad, households and things believe they're going to be bad forever. So what does that create? Well, that creates kind of an unrealistic view of the world. Okay. If you haven't lived long enough, there will be good times in your life and there will be bad times in your life. That's just how life works. Your life probably won't continue to be bad forever unless you believe it to be that way. Unfortunately, it will not be good forever too, even if you believe it to be that way. There will be good and bad times in everyone's lives. And as individuals, we sometimes know that. However, sometimes we can get caught up in the moment and not plan that there will be bad times when there's really good times, or that times will get better when there's bad. We tend to oversimplify the world. Oh, it's going to be bad forever. Oh, it's going to be great forever. It's going to be neither. It's going to be both. Right? The economy is going to fluctuate. There's going to be good and bad. And there are things that cause fluctuations, right? We talk about booms and recessions abroad, stock market crashes and booms. And we talked about what happens if the policymakers do nothing. It's destabilizing for the moment, but the economy will self-adjust. But the problem is it takes a while for the economy to self-adjust. And as a politician, I may not be reelected if I wait for the economy to fix itself. So they want to get involved. And so what they believe is that the government should use policies to fix our fluctuations. So when it falls below the natural rate, we want to use expansionary. So when we're in a recession, right, we want to increase aggregate demand. When we're over the natural rate, we want to decrease aggregate demand. So here, usually the problem is unemployment, right? So we're usually over 5%. Here, the problem is inflation. We're going to usually use the 2 number, so we're over 2. It's rare for us to be both over 5 and over 2. Remember, that's called stagflation. Usually we only have one problem, and if we only have one problem, then it's easy to fix. If our problem is inflation, we decrease aggregate demand. If our problem is unemployment, we increase aggregate demand. However, just like we talked about monetary policy, right? With monetary policy, it's not the government that's necessarily slow. It's businesses. However, with fiscal policy, it's the other way around. Congress is slow. It takes long times for Congress and the president to get together to make things happen. So because of these lags, and because it takes a while for Congress to get things in action, and then after they agree, they still have to, what we call, operationalize it, make things happen for the economy to change. And so what economists often will argue is that they really can't do a very good job of this, at least from government spending standpoint, because it takes too long. Usually taxes work a little better. They just give people money. They give them a tax break, right? They call those stimulus checks. They decrease your taxes. And these go quickly. It's easier to get those into the economy than to change government policy. However, even those sometimes take a while before they'll even get into the economy. So if you filed your taxes, there's still some people that haven't gotten what they call the first stimulus check all the way from last April. So there is still lags in the policy, even the simple ones. And what economists worry about is these policies may not work, right? So if I'm worried about shifting aggregate demand to get us back to natural, what happens if it takes too long and we're already back to natural? Well, what might happen is that when I shift this, it might cause us to actually go beyond where we should have been. Because by the time the policy goes into effect, conditions have changed. So people who are against stabilization believe government should focus on economic growth and inflation. So they believe government should spend a lot of time talking about infrastructure and regulations and money supply to maintain that we have economic growth and low inflation. So that's where they should focus on, is not focus on trying to fix today's issues, but what's wrong with us going forward? How can we fix the long run goals, not the short run goals? So back to this cartoon, I think it really hits how the government behaves. Recession is coming, recession is here, recession is over. This takes about 11 months. Done. Average recession is done in 11 months. And here comes the government. Wait, I can do something. It's already done. Right, so if you even look at the economy today and what's happening, because we're probably close to here. Not everyone's back to work, but we're pretty much over it. If you look at a lot of the numbers on growth in GDP, unemployment, we're probably here. There might not need to be another stimulus. The recession is over. Anything that we probably have may not get there. So how do we adjust that? What they do is they talk about automatic stabilizers. So because the government is slow, what we do is we have changes in fiscal policy to stimulate aggregate demand when the economy goes into a recession. These occur without deliberate action. So these are just kind of built-in stabilizers in the economy. So for example, the tax system. As you make less money, taxes decrease. So taxes fall automatically, which increases aggregate demand. Also, the government will give people more money in welfare and unemployment insurance. Those are automatic. So government spending rises when these things go into effect, and that stimulates aggregate demand as well. So some of these are ideas that we've set up. So we don't have to talk about, well, do we need unemployment insurance when there's a recession? It's already there. We already have limits for people to be on welfare. So if you have certain income levels, you'll qualify for welfare. Well, during recessions, more people lose income, so more people end up on welfare. Are there any questions then about chapter 21? So kind of a quick reminder to it. Let me see. Remember the goal in chapter 21. But I never draw it right. So we always want to end up here. So the goal of chapter 21 is, how do I get the economy to end up there where all 3 points cross? Okay, sometimes we're going to have aggregate demand here, that we're in a recession. Okay. So I will ask you, what can the government do then to get us to that big point in the middle? How do we get there? Well, very simple. The easiest way we get there with government intervention is to move aggregate demand. With no government intervention, we talked about before. Oops, that was a bad draw. Remember, we talked about it before. With no government intervention, what happens is the economy adjusts itself through short-run aggregate supply. So this is no government. This one is government intervention. So what we see is that, so how do we get back to the original point? Well, what we're going to have to do is get aggregate demand to shift to the right. So how does aggregate demand shift right? Right, you can do monetary policy, which is increasing the money supply. Or you can do fiscal policy, which is increasing G or decreasing T. So when we talk about stabilizing the economy, that's what I mean. So I'll ask quiz questions. We end up at point one. How does the federal government stabilize the economy? Sometimes I'll ask monetary policy, and I'll ask you, how do we increase the money supply? And you should be able to tell me. Or we'll talk about fiscal policy, and you should be able to tell me it's either increasing G or decreasing T. So I have lots of different ways. Well, how do we get there? Or I could go the other way. I could be, the economy is over here. How do we get back to the stabilizing point? And what can the government do? Well, here it wants to shift aggregate demand left. Right? It does the opposite, right? It decreases money supply, decrease G, or increase T. So all of those are possibilities. So remember, for the government to intervene, it's going to move most of the time aggregate demand. If the economy self-regulates, it's going to self-regulate through short-run aggregate supply. Investment accelerators are exactly the same as government spending multipliers. They just call it that. They just call it investment accelerators. So it's just the fancy term for government spending multipliers with investment. So if you remember back on our slides, let me slide back through here. This one. Right. So changes here, that's what they call investment accelerators. If you read in the book, that's the term there. That's just applying the multiplier effect to changes with investment. I guess they just don't like investment multipliers, but that's what it is. I don't like the term the ebook uses, but I can't always change those terms. So a lot of times what I tell students is sometimes the book uses terms that aren't exactly the same as me. That happens. Sometimes it'll be on the test as well. But if you think about what's an investment accelerator, what are they talking about? Oh, they're talking about using a multiplier effect with investments. They're not trying to introduce any really new ideas that we haven't quite kind of talked about already. Very good question, though. Other questions?